As we get ready to say goodbye to Splash Mountain for good here in the domestic Disney parks, today we're taking a look back at the way this original Disneyland attraction was opened. If you grew up in the 80s or 90s, you're sure to be familiar with the name Ernest P. Worrell. Did you know that Ernest was part of the Splash Mountain grand opening marketing? That's right. Today we're taking a look back at the TV special Ernest Goes to Splash Mountain, where Ernest was the first rider of the soon-to-be defunct attraction. Joining me to discuss is David Pagano, the director of the upcoming documentary, The Importance of Being Ernest. Plus, did you know that Ernest had an official relationship with Disney far beyond this TV special, and that he was even represented in 2 Walt Disney World theme parks? Hear about all of that and so much more as David and I take a retro trip back in time to discuss Ernest Goes to Splash Mountain.
It's time to turn back the clock because nostalgia is king.
Hello and welcome to the show, Ernest mega fan, director of The Importance of Being Ernest documentary, David Pagano. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
I'm very excited to have this conversation with you. As I was saying, I've actually had this idea for the episode for a very long time. I was just waiting for that time when we had to say goodbye to Splash Mountain. So I'm happy to finally do it. And, you know, it's interesting. The whole, Ernest fandom, I grew up with it for sure. It was the 90s primarily, right?
Yes, that's when the movies... It's interesting because the movies are kind of done theatrically by the early 90s. But of course, that's when you get them playing on TV a bunch, which is how I became familiar with Ernest as a kid.
Okay, so I know that there is, a section of the public who just really doesn't know Ernest, which always surprises me. I'm not surprised if somebody says, "Oh, I'm not a fan," but I'm always surprised when I have no idea who you're talking about. So, for those folks, can you just kind of give a bit of background on the character of Ernest and also how you became a fan of Ernest, which I know is a very tough thing to discuss in a short period of time, but give it your best shot.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. All right. So where did Ernest come from? So Ernest is, from his genesis, he started as a commercial character, basically a pitchman who would talk about various products. Part of how I came to know so much about Ernest is from a podcast I produced called Ernest Goes to Podcast, where we talk about his origins on that show. We sort of describe him as the original influencer, whereas you had certain people the Micro Machine guy or Joe Azuzu, people who were very tied to specific brands. I guess a modern equivalent might be like Flo, the progressive lady. But Ernest, on the other hand, he didn't stand for one product. He would pitch Sprite. He would pitch car dealerships, news programs, gas companies. He was basically all these local markets and very wide variety of products. And because he did it in these local markets, everybody thought he was kind of their hometown boy. So he kind of became this influencer. He went viral in a time when that wasn't a phrase yet, and just really built up this following. So starting from these humble beginnings as a commercial pitchman, eventually making his way to being, for all intents and purposes, a movie star.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, well, first of all, to me, the best comparison, although it's kind of a bad comparison because this wasn't an ad guy, but Pee Wee Herman always comes to mind.
Absolutely.
When I think of Ernest, because they were both characters that were kind of portrayed in a way where these actors didn't exist in a way. Like Pee Wee is Pee Wee, Ernest is Ernest. There is no Paul Reubens playing Pee Wee, Jim Bart. Even though in the credits it would say it, I don't know. They just felt like real people. And so that's how, I always think of Pee Wee as the equivalent. And funny story behind that, one year for Halloween, I was dressed as Pee Wee Herman. And I went to the huge Halloween party in West Hollywood. And I came across an Ernest. And I was like, oh my God. It just felt, there was never a Pee Wee Ernest crossover, but it felt like there should have been. And in that moment there was, and I just remember going up to this stranger and being like, I need a photo with you. This is too crazy. They were both in that same time period. But yeah, in any case, I always kind of equate him to Pee Wee Herman. I don't know if that makes sense because he wasn't an ad guy. Yeah.
Well, but I think even at some point in interviews, Jim Varney might have compared it, like saying like, "Oh, me being associated with Ernest was kind of became like a Pee Wee Herman thing."
Okay.
But actually, on the Ernest podcast that I did, we spent 2 whole episodes talking about what I call Ernest analogs, which are basically these characters in pop culture that are kind of analogous to Ernest, similar, whether it's how the character sits in pop culture or how the relationship of a certain performer to the character. And if memory serves me correct, it's been a few years, but I think the top Ernest analogs that we talked about were Pee Wee Herman, Bill and Ted, because they've got like this sort of like Shakespearean thing where they talk really eloquently and people think they're dumb, but they're not actually dumb. And then the third one was Doc Brown as this like zany inventor who inexplicably hangs out with children.
There we go. So the big question is, when did you become a fan? Do you remember these ads from back in the early days, or was that something that you learned about after?
Oh, I think I learned about Ernest from my parents, because my parents would always, quote commercials. They would wake us up for school by saying, "Time to make the donuts." So I don't know if that's the case. That might be me spinning my own lore in a very Ernesty way. But I know I can say for sure that we had Ernest Scared Stupid, Ernest Goes to Jail, and Ernest Saves Christmas on VHS when I was a kid. And I would always watch Ernest Saves Christmas with my friend next door. And Ernest Scared Stupid is just iconic in our household. I have 2 brothers, and anytime any of us would need to go to the refrigerator for a gallon of milk, it was always, "Can you pass me the authentic Bulgarian Miak?" For some reason, that joke, it has resonated through the ages, and that's how I came to Ernest as a child. Fast forward to, I guess I was like 30, and I ended up starting this podcast with my friend Aaron. We were both filmmakers by trade, both animators. We ended up seeing one of the Ernest commercial compilations on YouTube, and we were just struck by the art and the craft of it. Jim Varney is in the camera, like right up to his face. So he's not reading a cue card. He's got it all memorized, and he's doing these ads that are all in one take. And if you screw up at, second 29, you got to start all over. And that really resonated with me personally, because I work in stop motion animation, and that's a very similar thing. If you're animating a scene and you screw up, you drop the puppet, you hit the set, 6 hours in, you got to start all over most of the time. So I really felt like fascinated and drawn in by these ads, and it was like, what is this all about? Why do these exist? Why is there a compilation of them? Who is Ernest? What does he mean? And from there, my friend Aaron and I, we spent so much time talking about it off mic that we were like, we should just record some of this. And so that's how Ernest Goes to podcast started. We talked about every single thing that Ernest had ever said, done, or appeared in on our podcast over the course of about 5 or 6 years. And yeah, it really just took as deep of a dive as anyone could take into the Ernest lore.
One of the things that's kind of interesting, I was comparing him to Pee-wee earlier, is Jim Varney. First of all, Disney fans listening, if you don't know Ernest or the name Jim Varney, he is the voice of Slinky Dog in the Toy Story films. So that's kind of how Disney fans know him. But Jim Varney did not create this character, correct? Somebody else created it and cast him. Isn't that right?
Ernest was basically created by an ad agency they had an advertisement they had to make for a theme park, not Disney. The theme park was in such poor shape that the advertising agency was like, we can't show the theme park on camera. Let's just have a guy talk about the theme park. And so they hired Jim Varney, who they had previously worked with on these ads in the 70s, where he played a character called Sergeant Glory. Sergeant Glory is nothing like Ernest. He's like kind of like a straight-laced drill sergeant. But he actually does appear in the Ernest TV show in the late 80s. And so they did this ad. The theme park, believe it or not, never went anywhere.
Which park is it? Do you know?
The theme park was actually called Beach Bend, and I think it had some kind of country music connection. I might be wrong about that. Anyway, that was where the character of Ernest originated. So it was a combination of the needs of advertising and the talents of Jim Varney kind of coalescing. The folks at the ad agency were John Cherry, who went on to direct almost all of the Ernest movies, And I think there was a guy named Tom Farrell who was also involved and kind of parted ways later. Because the theme park didn't go anywhere, they sort of put Ernest aside until later. And some other clients of theirs saw that on like a demo reel or something like that, and were like, "Oh, let's use this character. Who's this guy?" And from there, it just sort of went to where it went.
It's so crazy. But I guess the difference between something like Pee Wee Herman or Elvira, like Jim didn't own the character because he didn't create it. Is that right?
Correct.
Big money loss there.
It's weird. There's this thing that we came across in an old article, this idea of like the character curse, where it's like certain actors and certain characters become like inexorably tied to each other. So like Adam West and Batman, or, I think somewhere in that article was like Robin Williams and Mork. But because Robin Williams later, after that article was written, had so much time to do all these other things, that sort of doesn't occur to people anymore. But certainly with Jim Varney, I think if you read articles or interviews with him, he kind of goes back and forth about like, some days Ernest is a blessing and some days Ernest is a curse. And certainly the thing I always say about him is, and this kind of ties into what you were saying, is that Jim Varney played Ernest so it would be very easy for Ernest to be like a one-off kind of character, like, like a Geico caveman or something like that. But Jim played him with such depth and such sincerity and such just like incredible craft that he made people believe Ernest was a real person.
Yeah.
And that's incredible.
Yeah, he was definitely one of those characters that like when you saw Jim in real life in the public, you would say Ernest, not Jim, so it's one of those things. But in any case, this character became so big that when Splash Mountain opened at Disneyland, they decided to make a TV special starring Ernest. Now, Splash Mountain is closing forever at Disneyland very soon on May 31st, 2023, in order to make way for Tiana's Bayou Adventure. Now, this version at Disneyland was the first ever Splash Mountain attraction, and it was later replicated at Walt Disney World and Magic Kingdom, as well as at Tokyo Disneyland. The original Disneyland attraction opened on July 17th, 1989, which was actually Disneyland's 34th anniversary. And interestingly enough, when it closes, it'll be just about 34 years that it's been open. So it opened on the 34th anniversary and it's run for just about 34 years, a little bit under. So that's kind of a fun little coincidence there. And of course, it already closed at Walt Disney World on January 23rd, 2023. So the name of the special is Ernest Goes to Splash Mountain. It first aired on Disney Channel on July 7th, 1989, which was 10 days before the attraction opened. And I gotta be honest, I was not super familiar with this. I don't even know how I originally came across it, but when I did, I just always knew, I've got to talk about this on the podcast, because this was, I guess 1989 would have been a time when you still had to pay for Disney Channel. It wasn't part of basic cable, so I didn't have it. And it started out there. So that's probably a big part of the reason why I wasn't familiar. But when did you come across Ernest Goes to Splash Mountain?
Yeah, I didn't know that this special existed before we did Ernest Goes to podcast. I think, it almost sounds like a joke. Like people, sort of flippantly talk about the Ernest films. Like, yeah, it was Ernest Goes to Camp, Ernest Goes to Jail, Ernest Goes to Splash Mountain, like all those ones. Those are all real things.
Yeah.
It's weird because I would, again, in the faultiness of my Mandela effect memory, I would almost believe that I saw this because I remember watching similar specials about Disneyland and Walt Disney World where there would be a special that's like, oh, here's this new ride coming out called Body Wars. Let's do like a 22-minute thing about it. What you're saying makes sense. I imagine it probably was also content for the Disney Channel that they could then just repurpose. But 1989 is also when MGM Studios comes out, right?
That's right? True. Disney MGM Studios opened in 1989. There is a tie to Ernest in that, which we'll get to a bit later on, which is fun as well. But the official description of this says Ernest P. Worrell, which is the way I've always pronounced it, and I've heard it pronounced Worrell. In this special, for some reason, everybody, it's like a fake newscast, and everybody pronounces it Worrell, and it kind of threw me through a loop. I'm like, I'm pretty sure it's Ernest P. Worrell.
It's funny because a lot of times when people, before I came back in my Ernest fandom, I always said Worrell because I'm a big Talking Heads fan, and in Stop Making Sense, there's I believe a keyboardist named Bernie Worrell. But our headcanon for why people call Ernest Worrell is that they're trying to treat him with respect. Like, oh, his name couldn't possibly be Worrell. That sounds so awkward. Ernest P. Worrell? It's like, I think John Cherry, in fact, picked that name because he wanted it to sound like someone had marbles in their mouth when they said it. Just like a very awkward name for this awkward character.
I like it. I like that reasoning. But in any case, Ernest P. Worrell becomes the world's first Splashronaut when he volunteers to be the first person to ride Splash Mountain. And as I said, it was kind of set up as this fake newscast. Like, there's this big news, there's this big new attraction opening at Disneyland, and we see, you know, Ernest preparing for this first ride. Most of the special, he's actually not at Disneyland. Some of the newscasters are, but we see him with this off-camera character that maybe you can touch upon named Vern. And Ernest is kind of for this big accomplishment, I guess. Sitting in a log and falling over the edge. Needs some training, apparently.
At Ernest and Vern's Daredevil training camp, aka Vern's backyard, it looks like, which, as we've gone into the documentary, actually just seems like it was Jim Varney's backyard, but I digress. So the first 4 Ernest films are Disney. I believe they're released through Touchstone Pictures.
Yeah.
And so this is a time when there's this weird crossover between very Ernest things and very Disney-ish Disney things. And I think Ernest Goes to Splash Mountain is like the perfect encapsulation of like that sort of contrast, because you're right, certain parts of this feel very much like this is just a lot of the time when you see Ernest in Disney things or appearing in specials, it's basically reuse of ad gags, and they were great at this. We've learned that they had like basically a warehouse of like, oh, this is the box for all the props we need for the pancake gag. This is the box we need for the gag where Ernest drops the piggy bank. And so they're just reusing ad gags. Ernest on a tire swing, I believe, and Ernest doing the pull-ups where he puts his feet above the pull-up bar and then his shoes fly off. These are classic. You could easily swap out Splash Mountain for any product, any soft drink or local hamburger joint. And it's interesting because when I first saw this, there was a lot of questions that came up. Why is Ernest in this? First and foremost, I think Ernest is basically pitching Splash Mountain. This is a commercial for Splash Mountain. He is the pitch man for it. Where you go deeper into things then is, you know, when we did our Ernest Goes to podcast episode about this special, we talked about, well, why would they pick Ernest? Why is he in this? He has nothing to do with the ride. And then we were like, okay, well, maybe it's because Ernest is like an indestructible cartoon character. So they had this partnership with Disney. They're doing this thing. Okay, who can we get to be a ride tester, to be a world-renowned ride tester, I believe they call him in the special. That seems like something that Ernest just made up and told them. Again, the lore. But then in thinking about it more, we also wondered whether it was just like, we have this ride. Song of the South is a Southern property. Who's like a Southern character that's like a real person that we could get to talk about this? How about Ernest? So there's a lot of conjecture about why this exists and what exactly this is.
Yeah, those are some interesting points. I hadn't really thought of it other than just Ernest was popular at the time.
It could be as simple as that too. Yeah.
That was always my assumption. I was going to talk about this later, but since you brought it up, let's talk about it now. Because do you know how Ernest got involved with Disney? Because I've heard a story and I'm curious if you heard the same thing. It involves Michael Eisner.
As it often does. Ernest got his start with Disney because he was, I believe, the guest of honor or like some sort of guest spot at the Indy 500 in the mid 80s. And when they had like this character parade, and basically in the character parade was Ernest, and there was also some Disney characters. And let's just say that the Disney characters did not get the raucous response that Ernest got. And so that led, I believe, Michael Eisner and probably Jeffrey Katzenberg to be like, who's this Ernest guy? We should check out what this is. And eventually that led to the partnership, which gave us Ernest Goes to Camp and then 3 other films over the course of, I guess, like half a decade.
Okay, so that story is true, because that's always what I'd heard. I've always heard it as like a parade or something. I assumed it was an Anaheim parade, but you're saying it was the Indy 500?
If you look on, I believe on our Facebook page for the documentary, we have photos of Ernest in the car at the event.
All right, very cool. I'm glad to know that that's like actually a true story because I was never really sure. So here we go, fact checked. So Vern, he's doing these, he's practicing with Vern, but talk a little bit about Vern because Vern is a character that appears in a lot of Ernest stuff. Sometimes not the movies, sometimes yes, the movies, often on the TV show, but we don't know Vern. We've never seen Vern. We've never heard Vern.
Right. You said Vern appears, and I'm going to put appears in air quotes because Vern is basically the camera. Vern is all of us. We are all Vern. And, again, there's conjecture as to whether Vern is a real person or does Ernest just call everyone Vern? There's like an Ernest newsletter from the 80s where he has like tips for social etiquette. And I believe one of them is when all else fails, just call everyone Vern. And it's like, okay, well, does he do that in reality? Is this really trying to unpack the depths of Ernest's mind and the reality of the world that he inhabits is a fascinating thing. But no, Vern is basically, it's interesting in the same way that Ernest kind of predates the sort of like viral influencer kind of character. The way that the commercials were shot also kind of predates this cinema verite, like Arrested Development, The Office, Parks and Rec, that kind of handheld camera style of comedy. And it's, I'm sure things like, well, I don't know. This is Spinal Tap was even, I think, a little bit after, because Ernest started in like 1980. So it's interesting that Vern is, for all intents and purposes, the camera's perspective, and that it kind of, I don't know, it sets a tone for a later, almost like entire style of comedy cinematography.
Know what I mean, Vern?
If anybody does.
Very cool. So in this special, of course, Splash Mountain is themed around the now controversial film Song of the South. I think even back then in 1989, it was kind of controversial, so it's a little surprising that they did a whole attraction based on it. But in this special, they mention Song of the South by name. They even show clips of the movie in the special. So obviously the company was comfortable enough with the film at the time. And they mentioned some fun facts about the attraction that I'll mention here. It is a 5-story plunge. They call it the world's longest and steepest flume drop, which I do remember at the time seeing that drop and that angle and being like, holy crap, that's terrifying. And then, not too much later, we get an attraction like Jurassic Park the Ride, which is just like so much bigger and so much steeper that Splash Mountain looks like nothing these days. But at the time, it was the world's longest and steepest flume drop. It drops at a 47-degree angle. The top speed, they say, is 40 miles per hour, making it the fastest ride at Disneyland at the time. I don't think anything faster's come along, so perhaps that drop is the fastest ride at Disneyland still, I'm not sure, and it features 105 animatronic figures. And I don't know, was there anything in particular that stuck out to you with this special that you'd like to talk about?
Well, certainly the fact that, I found this at a local book swap recently. The listeners can't see this, but I'm holding up a Disney Uncle Remus soundtrack. This film is from the 40s. I don't really know why it was getting a brand new theme park ride in 1989. Like can you imagine? Like that's almost, it's like 43 years, something like that. Like can you imagine them doing like opening a new ride now from a film from 43 years ago? That seems very unlikely.
Yeah, it's interesting because the genesis of Splash Mountain was that the person running Disneyland at the time wanted a flume ride. And Tony Baxter was thinking about it. And at the time, there was an attraction called America Sings over in Tomorrowland. And they were getting ready to close it. And they had all of these audio animatronic figures in there that Tony Baxter, for one reason or another, popped in his mind. This could work into a flume ride based around Song of the South. But yeah, it is. I don't know. Maybe he was a fan of the film or something, or maybe he caught it on TV the night before. I'm not sure. I haven't heard those details before, but yeah, it is interesting. I kind of like the idea. Like, I am not the type of person that feels like every attraction needs to be based on the newest and hottest property. I think it's kind of cool that they went back in the history of Disney filmmaking and was like, you know what, this deserves an attraction. And, listen, there are many varied opinions on that attraction these days, but for decades, it has been entertaining people. Still to this day, I feel like long lines for it, especially on a hot day. It's not like this attraction is not closing because it's lost popularity. It's closing because of controversial issues. And yes, the desire to bring in a Tiana attraction, but at the same time, it's like, well, they could have built a brand new Tiana attraction. So it's interesting just to see a ride closing, even when it still has such long lines. But speaking of the Imagineers behind this, the show producer for Splash Mountain was Bruce Gordon, and he was interviewed, for lack of a better term, on this special by one of these fake newscasters. And I say for lack of a better term because they keep going to Bruce Gordon to ask him a question, and basically as soon as he starts answering, they take the microphone away, and she basically answers the question for him, and he's basically a prop. Like, there's no reason for him to be there. Now, Bruce Gordon sadly passed away in 2007. He was a big Imagineer and wrote a lot of Disney books and stuff. I was a little surprised, though, when they kept teasing, oh, we're going to be talking with an Imagineer. I assumed it was going to be Tony Baxter, because Tony Baxter is the Imagineer that I think of when I think of Splash Mountain. And then when I saw what they actually did with Bruce, I was like, that's why Tony didn't do it. Like, there's no need for this to be here.
Yeah, it's interesting. A couple of things about that. I feel like Bruce Gordon comes off really well. I assume he's not like an actor. Like he plays that gag really well in the special. Like, I would almost, not to disparage anyone, I almost feel like he plays the comedy a little bit better than some of the news commentators do. It's also funny that you say the thing about reusing the animatronics from America Sings. It's fascinating that Ernest, a commercial pitchman known for reusing gags for different clients, is also tied into this ride that is essentially reusing. Like, this is all incredibly economical. And I wonder if that's also a part of it, where it's like something about Ernest is like, this can help us meet our budget requirements in a certain way.
One of the things that's kind of funny about this is, as you said, that it was done for an economic way, reusing these animatronics from America Sings. But once it becomes a hit, they end up building 2 more of them. There aren't any more America Sings to close. So they end up having to build all of these animatronic figures from scratch for the new iterations. So what started as a budget project, I guess they saved as far as the designs and plans go. With those future iterations, they could reuse that stuff. But yeah, they end up making a mega hit attraction. I mean, this for a long time, Splash Mountain was the e-ticket attraction, I feel like. And, it got its own TV special. Not every attraction gets that. So, and not only its own TV special, but its own TV special featuring one of the most popular characters of the time. So it's kind of wild.
It is. Yeah, no, I feel like all of this could not have happened at any other time in history. Just the sort of confluence of Ernest and Disney. It's funny because in my brain, I'm always like, 1989, this ride opened. It must have been in Disney MGM Studios. It was not. It's in the Magic Kingdom.
Yeah.
It's just like something, again, my memory being like trying to make logical sense of where perhaps there is none.
Yeah, and it didn't get to Florida till years later. So this 1989 one is the Disneyland California version. Several years later, it hopped over to Magic Kingdom due to its popularity. But
I'm an East Coast kid, so.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier Flo, the progressive woman, the character, and now I just love, like, you said this couldn't happen today. I'm like, if it did happen today, it would be Flo. Like, that's... I'm trying to think who would do it, because Ernest isn't around to do it. Flo, maybe? I don't
do this special, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't, gosh, if this happened today, who would do it?
It would be Sean Giambrone, the star of the Goldbergs on ABC. Do you know the kid?
I have a face in mind. I've never seen the Goldbergs with any great detail, although there is a great Ernest throwaway gag in an episode of the Goldbergs.
That doesn't surprise me at all. It's that perfect time period, right?
One of the characters shows up and asks, like, 2 tickets to Ernest Saves Christmas, please. And the guy's like, oh, sorry, it's sold out. And he's like, no, I know Ernest Saves Christmas, but I need to know how.
I'm telling you, Ernest was a big staple of pop culture back then. Even shows being made today about the 80s and 90s refer to him. So It's pretty crazy. As I mentioned, one of the fun things that this special mentions is the fact that before Splash Mountain, this area of the park was actually called Bear Country, and it was based around the Country Bear Jamboree, which was there. But when Splash Mountain opened, it was renamed to Critter Country. Eventually, the Country Bear Jamboree was removed. Winnie the Pooh was brought in, but they do specifically mention the renaming of the land in this special. And finally, most of the special, Ernest is not actually in the park. As we said, he's off, getting ready in Vern's backyard. And Ernest finally appears. He gets the hero's welcome on Main Street, USA. He's being lifted in the air, walked down Main Street. People have their, Go Ernest t-shirts and their giant signs with his face printed on it. Pretty wild entry into Disneyland, I would say.
Absolutely. And this is, again, one of those weird brain trips where trying to separate Ernest and Jim Varney becomes more and more difficult, because you're absolutely right. The way he is greeted is like he is a hero returning from some great adventure. Gosh, the height of the Ernest popularity when he first came out is probably right around this time. So this is, in addition to being a time capsule of the opening of this ride, it's also kind of a wonderful preservation of just the heights of popularity that Ernest had reached at this time. And Jim Varney, by association, there's Ad Ernest and then there's Film Ernest, and they're kind of two different characters. We have this headcanon potentially that Ad Ernest is an actor who plays Film Ernest. So it's Jim Varney playing Ernest in the ads, and then Ernest in the ads playing Ernest in the films. Don't think about it too hard. But there's definitely weird kind of moments in this special where, just for a second, it almost feels like it stops being Ernest on camera that you're seeing and it starts being Jim Varney. There's a bit where he's on Main Street and he gets a little bit like emotional or sheepish, and it's like, you can, Jim is an incredible actor, but it's almost like the line between Ernest and Jim Varney really does start to blur in a visual way. But also it's cool to see. I think you talked about pop culture references to Ernest, and certainly in his heyday and a little bit after, the pop culture references were not kind. There was a lot of Ernest as a stand-in for, this is a joke about a terrible movie that no one would ever see. You got Ernest Goes Somewhere Cheap on The Simpsons. I believe there's a Beavis and Butthead reference, those kinds of things. So to see this sort of celebration of a character and a performer that I'm incredibly fond of, in the time when he was around, part of the thing we haven't even really talked about is that Jim's been gone for over 20 years. And that's, it's a big reason that we're doing the documentary now. And it's a reason why I like talking about him in venues like this, just because for a long time he was this sort of footnote or even punchline. And I think, people would be very sort of dismissive of Jim's performance and be like, oh yeah, when's Ernest getting his Oscar? And it's like, well, he did get an Emmy for Outstanding Children's Performer for the TV show, but that's neither here nor there. Anyway, it's wonderful to see him so celebrated, even within the context of something where he's being celebrated for being the Splastronaut, but really it feels like he's being celebrated because this is the height of Ernest's popularity.
Yeah, when did he die? What year was it?
2000.
2000, so 23 years ago. So that would have been the time when, the Ernest films weren't being made anymore. He did have a career beyond Ernest. He did other films and, as we said, Slinky Dog and Toy Story. So he kept working. But do you happen to know, was when he passed away or, right before, what were his feelings toward Ernest? Was he Ernest was the butt of the joke at that time. There was no nostalgia for him. So do you happen to know or have talked to anybody who has feelings about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. It kind of differs from interview to interview. Sometimes Jim is sort of more nostalgic himself about Ernest and the role that he played in his career. Sometimes he's a little bit more, not as fond of the character. Sometimes he contradicts himself in the same interview. So it's I think it's a complicated question, and certainly I'm sure Ernest held him back from being able to do certain things. When Jim Varney was in the Beverly Hillbillies, where he played Jed Clampett,
the movie.
Yes, the movie, correct, not the TV show. The 90s was a wonderful time for every retro sitcom being turned into a feature film. The director, Penelope Spheris, really had to like fight for him to be cast because everyone was like, well, this is just Ernest. But then like his performance in the film is really good. And then all the reviews that we've found, so many of them are like, well, he's really good at this. Why don't people cast him as anything other than Ernest? And it's like, well, you just answered your own question. Like, people couldn't see him as anything other than Ernest, so they wouldn't cast him as anything other than Ernest. And then now it's like, well, gosh, he might be an actor.
Yeah, well, it should be noted that number one, Jim Varney was a seriously trained actor, like a Shakespearean actor who happened to fall into this silly character that, yes, is silly and ridiculous, but believable. It's not hyperbole to say that people believed Ernest was a real person. And yeah, a lot of times those were kids thinking that, but still, like, Jim created a character that was totally believable, and that's not something you can just do. Not everybody can do that. That is a skilled and trained actor right there. So that should be said. But yeah, it's all very interesting. In any case, Ernest finally gets to ride the ride at the end of this special. One little fun note, if you're a Disney nerd, you'll notice he actually enters the attraction through the exit, which I think they use for like handicap entrance now and maybe single rider. But yeah, he enters from the exit. He gets his own log. He goes through the ride. They're showing shots of inside the attraction, which was fun to see. And we also see shots of Ernest and his reactions. And of course, they're over the top and ridiculous. And when he goes down the fall, like, it's very dramatic. But it's always fun. I love seeing video clips, professionally shot video clips inside of a theme park ride. I think is always so great and kind of rare. So it's kind of fun to have that footage. And, not only that, but the attraction looking in its best shape. These days, for like the last year plus, they know it's going to close and they have not been taking very good care of it for that reason. So it's nice to see it when it was shiny and new, and Ernest enjoying it and being the quote unquote first test rider for the attraction.
Yeah, a big part of the reason we're doing this documentary is, there's a number of reasons, but a big one is preservation. And, so much of this stuff that was part of the Ernest oeuvre might just be lost forever. And so that feels very similar to, like, kind of what you're expressing right now. Thank goodness this footage exists for this ride that's about to be not demolished, but is about to be changed inexorably into something else. Yeah, it's nice to have that, and certainly this is again the an interesting part of this special is once Ernest gets to Disneyland. Earlier in the special, there's a very clear delineation between this is the Ernest footage done by the Ernest team, this is the Disney stuff done by Disney. You can kind of feel the types of humor and the types of jokes don't exactly line up. There's overlap, but it's not quite meshing. And then when they come together at the end, that still happens. So it's really fascinating to see Ernest and these other sort of like comedy players that I guess I don't know if they ever appeared in anything else. These newscaster folks. I believe Ralph Story, the guy at the desk, is an actual like newscaster, which I don't know, that again adds layers of complexity of like, well, should we take this at face value? Is this is a real newscaster? But anyway, just the way that Ernest's humor and the Disney humor sort of like combine in some ways, but also like kind of butt heads in some ways, where he says, "Call me a log," and everybody just shouts in unison, "You're a log." Like that's so awkwardly executed. But then I will say the one joke, and I don't know who's responsible for this, but it is so subtle. There's a bit early in the special where the classic character of Skip Binkman, whose name I cannot say more than a few times without bursting into laughter, he has a clipboard. He's talking about the ride, and he accidentally drops the clipboard into the water. Ha ha ha! So hilarious. He's so awkward. Later, when Ernest comes out of having tested Splash Mountain for the first time, for a split second, he's got a clipboard on his chest. And I feel like it took me seeing this multiple times to even pick up on that. Like, wait, is that Skip Binkman's clipboard? Who's like, someone thought of that. Someone else did it. There was continuity. It's a really bizarrely, almost surreal joke in this thing that's otherwise like very earnest humor and very sort of like broad, like jokey ha 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 comedy. Like there's just this very bizarre choice that I love dearly.
That's so funny. I did not catch that at all, but I love that that's a thing. Like that's an inside joke, right? Like for so few people to catch. That's fantastic. It is interesting hearing you talk about kind of the different sense of humor between Ernest and Disney, yet they're working together, right? Like Disney is paying to license this character or whatever the heck the deal was. It kind of reminds me of these days when we hear, oh, Disney bought Lucasfilm. And it's like, I mean, or Marvel. It's like, well, they're so different, but no, they are, now it is official. It is that. And at that time, Ernest was Disney, even though it was very, very different. But in any case, I want to talk a bit more about Disney and Ernest, but is there anything specific about the Splash Mountain special that you want to mention before we move on here?
I hope that it gets an official release at some point.
Disney Plus. You know what I will say? I was shocked by this as I was doing some research. There is mention of Ernest on the D23 website, the official Disney fan club that like Disney runs. If you go to d23.com and type in Ernest, like they have his films mentioned, this special is mentioned, and they're short little blurbs. But
no kidding.
There is recognition that Ernest was a part of the Disney family at one point. I was shocked by this.
That's fascinating. Wow. Yeah. I know there are like bits and pieces of like Ernest kind of like popping up. Like he was in like a Disneyland, I want to say like 35th anniversary special, like hanging out with Tony Danza or something like that, or calling him on the phone because he was at Vern's house. But even like in the parks, I remember there was like, I think there's an Ernest reference in the Q pre-show video for Cranium Command. And again, it's like that early 90s thing of like, we need a stand-in for a dumb person. Where's Ernest? And it's like, gets my ire.
So Disney did have this division called Touchstone Pictures where they made product that was, not quote unquote Disney-like. So the first film was Ernest Goes to Camp, which was 1987. So are you telling me the first Ernest movie was a Disney movie? They didn't make any Ernest movies before this. It was just the commercials?
Great question. There's going to be a lot of asterisks on this answer. So technically the first Ernest thing that was not a commercial was what's called Hey Vern, It's My Family album, also sometimes known as the Ernest and Vern comedy special, because, hey, audiences, this is Ernest and Vern from those commercials that you know. And yeah, it was like a made-for-TV kind of special where Jim Varney plays all of these like members of Ernest's family. So it's like, a guy from the Old West. There's a guy who is Ernest's cousin who inexplicably works at a carnival. There's like all these different characters, because that was a lot of what Jim Varney's comedy sensibility was playing these different characters. You should see his resume that we came across. It's wild. All the voices and impressions he could do, and all of the very variety show like skills that he had, like coin dexterity tricks and tightrope walking, and it was nuts. So yeah, so that is the first sort of non-commercial thing.
Where did people see that though? Was that like a TV special?
In a similar way to the commercials, it was locally syndicated. So if you were in a market that had Ernest commercials playing, chances are you would be able to turn on the TV one day and see this thing. And I believe by this time the Ernest P. Worrell International Fan Club had started, so you could probably get like information in the newsletters that was like, hey, this is going to air, like check your local listings, that kind of a thing. After that, and in, I want to say 1985 or 86, there is one of my favorite things that Jim Varney ever did, and I believe one of his favorites as well, is the little known, little talked about Dr. Otto and the Riddle of the Gloom Beam, which is a feature length film that played in, like, again, very local markets. It's not an Ernest film. Ernest later appeared on the VHS box covers because, hey, people at the video store, we want you to rent this thing. It's got that Ernest guy in it. Ernest appears in basically what amounts to a cameo, but really the film is like a Jim Varney showcase and is sort of a horror, science fiction, satire, adventure film. And Ernest. Now I'm even doing it. Jim Varney, the actor, the real person, plays Dr. Otto, who has the ability to morph into all of these different characters and sort of like menaces the protagonist of the film. And so that was sort of what we refer to as the Ernest Brain Trust, the people behind the Ernest series. That was sort of their first foray into feature films. And I don't know to what degree that might have been useful in the Disney deal as like a proof of concept. Like, look, we can make a feature. But for anyone who hasn't seen Dr. Otto and the Riddle of the Gloom Beam, I highly recommend it. It's worth checking out.
Okay, well, I think it's safe to say that the first major motion picture theatrical release starring Ernest the character was done by Disney Touchstone Pictures in 1987. Ernest Goes to Camp. I do remember seeing that that film in theaters. And then that was followed up by Ernest Saves Christmas in 1988, which I always want to love this movie more than I do just because I love Christmas movies. It's not one of my favorites, sadly, but it's worth mentioning for sure because this was very much highlighted at Disney MGM Studios, because when Disney MGM Studios opened, they very much wanted it to be a real working studio. So before it opened as a theme park to the public, they kind of like forced, for lack of a better term, certain projects to be shot there. One of them was Ernest Saves Christmas. If anybody remembers the old studio tour at Disney MGM Studios, now of course Disney's Hollywood Studios, the Ernest house was there. I believe it was like right across the street from the Golden Girls house on Residential Street. So Ernest in Disney theme parks actually have a really interesting history. And one other thing to tie it into Splash Mountain, which is really interesting. Another one of the projects that was kind of hoodwinked into shooting at Disney MGM Studios before it opened was the sequel to Splash, Splash 2. And the connection with Splash, the movie, and Splash Mountain is because of the popularity of that original film. That's why Splash Mountain is called Splash Mountain and not its original name, which was like a Zippity Log Ride or something like that. That's not exactly it, but it had very different name. And the top folks at Disney were like, well, Splash made a lot of money. Can't you throw a mermaid in there and make it related to them? And they're like, no. But the compromise was, we'll call it Splash Mountain.
Wow. I had no idea.
Yeah. It's kind of very weird. It works, right? It's worked all these years. It makes sense now. But Splash 2 was shot at Disney MGM Studios, and so was Ernest Saves Christmas. And did you ever get to see the house on the back lot there?
You know, again, I feel like I keep going back to this, but I want to say yes, but it's possible that never happened, and I'm remembering something else. Somewhere in the bowels of my studio are VHS tapes of my childhood trips to Walt Disney World. So I'm sure that I can go back and find things. But you're absolutely right. A lot of Ernest Saves Christmas was shot there. I believe when Ernest is driving the cab in the beginning of the film, he's actually driving down like the entranceway to Walt Disney World, because you can sometimes see like the highway signs in the background. You know, it's interesting that you also say that Christmas is something about it doesn't click for you. When the Disney deal happened with the Ernest folks, there was kind of two sides of it. Part of the deal involved the Ernest crew, the Ernest Brain Trust, providing Disney with pitch ideas or full script treatments for potential Ernest films, and I think for non-Ernest films as well. So there were all these like Ernest pitch documents that there's another podcast that you can check out called the Ernest P. Worrell Preservation Society, where they basically do read-throughs of all the script treatments. But so that you have that on one hand. On the other hand, Disney is also actively providing the Ernest Brain Trust with non-Ernest scripts that they're like, hey, maybe you can turn this into an Ernest movie. Ernest Saves Christmas was not originally an Ernest script. It was something that Ernest was inserted into later. And you can kind of tell, I think he is the main character, or he's sort of like the connective tissue of the film, but it's not the same as something like Ernest Scared Stupid, where he is like front and center. Ernest is almost more of not a bit player, but like a secondary character, or like the means by which all of these different characters kind of get connected in Ernest Saves Christmas. So it's interesting.
Yeah. And then after that, in 1990, they made Ernest Goes to Jail. And the final film, I believe, that Ernest made with Disney was Ernest Scared Stupid, which came out in 1991. This is my favorite Ernest movie by far. I talk all about it on my other podcast, That Halloween Podcast, Season 1, Episode 17, if people want to hear me talk more about that. And of course, I'll include a link to that in the show notes. And I should also mention that the Splash Mountain special is available on YouTube to watch. So I will include that in the show notes as well. But I love Ernest Scared Stupid. I think this is, listen, it has its flaws that Ernest movies do. They're low budget. There's some terrible acting, but I think it's a really fun story and an Ernest at his best, in my opinion.
I could not agree more. I will say for nostalgia purposes, Ernest Saves Christmas is always going to be my favorite just because of the fact that I grew up with it. But I think the best Ernest film, Ernest at his peak earnestness, is Ernest Scared Stupid. You know, you got the Kyoto Brothers effects in there are wonderful. The back and forth between Jim Varney as Ernest and Eartha Kitt as Old Lady Hackmore. That is Eartha Kitt's character in Ernest Scared Stupid. There's just wonderful business where I feel like that's where they really found like someone who could monologue as well as Jim Varney as Ernest does. And there's like scenes where they're like simultaneously in different rooms of her house and like monologuing, muttering to themselves. It's wonderful. I love that movie.
Yeah. Now, folks, whether you love or hate Ernest, the fact is he is part of Disney canon. My guess is a lot of people listening today had no idea about Ernest Goes to Splash Mountain, and even less idea that Ernest made movies with Disney. Ernest actually was a real part of the Walt Disney Company. So I think it's all fascinating and interesting. And of course, farewell to Splash Mountain and the domestic parks. And David, this was so much fun to talk about with you. Thank you for coming on. But before I let you go, you've mentioned your documentary several times. It's called The Importance of Being Ernest, based on the book, which is one of the greatest titles ever. But can you tell me a little bit about what's going on with the documentary, what part of the process you're at, and maybe when we can see it?
We had to call it The Importance of Being Ernest, not only because that's the name of Justin Lloyd's biography book, but also because every person on social media has made the joke, hey, why isn't there a documentary about Jim Varney called The Importance of Being Ernest? So joke's on you, social media people. Now there will be.
I saw somebody tweet the other day something hilarious to me where they were talking about the next movie, Fast 10, the 10th Fast. I think it's called Fast 10. And he was like, real missed opportunity. It should have been called Fast 10, your seatbelts, fasten your seatbelts. And I was like, honestly, that is dumb, but I love it. But I digress. Please, your documentary.
No worries. Doing Ernest Goes to podcast for so many years and becoming friends with Justin Lloyd. When Justin talked about writing his book, he mentioned that he felt like he might be the only one who could ever do it, because being a member of Jim's family and seeing sort of like the people who were important in Jim's life start to sort of like fade into the woodwork. Like he felt like he was perfectly positioned to write that book when he did. I think maybe almost 10 years ago now. And I felt very similarly knowing Justin and doing Ernest Goes to podcast. And having filmmaking experience myself, I felt perfectly positioned to do this documentary. The more I talk to people about like trying to get like old Ernest master tapes preserved and getting these interviews scheduled, the more it becomes clear that, now is the time to tell this story, because we're talking about like the late 80s a lot on this podcast. That is a time where so much stuff is just magnetic tape. And, in the process of doing the interviews, we started shooting interviews for this documentary last summer after a successful crowdfunding campaign the previous summer. So it's all been a process. But the more I talk to people and the more interviews we conduct, and we ask everyone, like, do you have any Ernest memorabilia you'd like to share? Do you have photos and stuff? And one thing we've asked a lot of the people who were involved in the making of the films is, does any of this film exist? A lot of the stuff at that time, commercial wise, some of it was shot on film, certainly, but a lot of it was finished on tape. And so we've been asking people like, hey, does this film exist anywhere? Like, can we go and find like negatives? And everyone's just like, no, all of that stuff is lost or destroyed. So really, like, Ernest fan that I am, like, now really feels like the time to do this and to preserve all this stuff in the exact same way that you described earlier, the having that footage of Splash Mountain, having all this Ernest stuff around and viewable by a new generation, it feels important. Especially for someone who again, like when I was growing up, felt like a punchline or felt like a footnote culturally. To see people now kind of, not only share Ernest films with their kids and like have it kind of go to the next generation that way, but also to sort of discover the Ernest fandom. The first thing we shot for this documentary was a fan event called Ernest Day, which takes place every year at the campground where they shot Ernest Goes to Camp. People were really sort of discovering that they are not the only Ernest fans out there, and it's really becoming kind of this nice celebration. And I think it's important for this kind of, for such a beloved American icon to have their stuff, their body of work just kind of like cast aside or dissolving in a back room somewhere. That seems like a shame. And if I can do something to sort of help tell that story and make it available for the next generation, then that seems like a cool project to take on, and sort of a way that I can thank Jim Varney for what he gave to me growing up and to a lot of kids. I say this constantly. One of the things that we hear so often from people who reach out to us about the documentary is Jim and Ernest were like the father I never had. They were like the sort of Fred Rogers presence growing up, where I didn't have a great family life, but I knew like I could talk to Ernest and I could, hug my Ernest doll and have this very sincere presence on television, talk directly to me and not like talk down to me and go through these wacky challenges, but sort of like keep that optimism and that hopefulness alive. And that's cool and worthy of record, I think.
Yeah, those are all fantastic reasons. I'm stoked that this exists. I've been following, I've been on your newsletter for a long time. I can't wait to see the final film, but I know that like in 2 days you're getting ready to fly out and record more interviews. So like, where are you in the process? Are you close to a finish line? Do you have a date that you're trying to hit?
Gosh. So we started this whole process. I think I had my first conversation with Justin in like 2018. We were ramping up for 2020, which would have been the, I believe, 40th anniversary of Ernest. That did not happen because of a little thing called the pandemic. But, since then, each phase of production has sort of determined whether the next one would happen or not. So, we had a Kickstarter campaign in 2021 because we couldn't find a better way to convince potential investors that there was this audience, that there was this interest. You need to have evidence. You need to have data to sort of say, yes, there is an audience for this story to be told, and people are passionate and want to know more about this character. So the Kickstarter campaign literally kickstarted our production. Without it, we might not be making this film, and I might not be talking to you today. That led to us starting to shoot in Nashville last year in 2022. And then based on the success of that, we made more connections and sort of made more plans and, have a familiarity with the crew that I've put together. And that's led us to do, Nashville was sort of the Ernest side of things. Now we're going to do Kentucky. That's sort of the Jim Varney side of things. And we're trying to get like our top tier interviews done ASAP. Unfortunately, a lot of these folks are getting on in years. We sadly lost John Cherry last year and didn't have a chance to interview him beforehand. So, again, like it's tough because, there is a level of urgency where it's like, these people are not getting any younger. This material is only going to deteriorate more and more. So we're doing the best we can to get it done quickly, but it's going to be another couple years for sure.
No, I love that you guys are doing this. I think it's super important. And where can folks find out more about this film?
So the film is The Importance of Being Ernest, and the website is beingernestfilm.com. You can, like I mentioned, we had a Kickstarter campaign that already finished, but you can actually pre-order the film and in a variety of formats. And we've got a couple other goodies, some digital stuff that you can also pick up if you feel so inclined. And yeah, all proceeds go directly towards the making of the film and the preservation of this character's legacy and this actor's legacy.
Excellent. And of course, I will include that link in the show notes as well, folks. So be sure to check out this episode's description for that. And David, thank you so much for coming on the show. This was a great conversation.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Jeff.
Thanks for tuning into this episode. Don't miss any future episodes by subscribing and following Dizney with a Z, coast to coast on your favorite podcast app, where episodes are available 24/7. If you're a longtime listener of the show, thank you. And if you have the means, consider supporting the show over on Patreon. By joining Disney Coast to Coast's Patreon membership, you'll gain access to extra bonuses, including live stream Ask Me Anythings, one of which is taking place next week, unreleased episodes, and more bonus content. Take a look at all that's available by clicking the Patreon link in this episode's description, and thank you for considering. Until next time, anything you need can be found in this episode's description, from additional information and links discussed in this episode found in the show notes, to the DCTC hotline where you can leave a voicemail and be heard on a future episode, contact info to reach me, access to the show's official website, some free gifts from me to you, and so much more. So be sure to check out this episode's description. Other than that, folks, have a magical day. Bye!